Bring them home, bring them home, bring our parents, our children home. From the dust of Afghanistan back to our arms, bring them home.
Bring them home, bring them home, bring our sons and our daughters home. From the ghettos of Baghdad back to our arms, bring them home.
Bring them.
Welcome to Peace Now. My name is Trudy Quaife. I'm a member of Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace. We're a local organization of friends and neighbors, and we've been advocating for peace and justice for almost 15 years. I'm your host today, and I'm joined by Jamaica Miles and Joe Lombardo. Jamaica is a local organizer and activist. She's the lead organizer for Citizen Action here in the Capital Region. And Joe Lombardo is co-coordinator of a national organization, United National Antiwar Coalition, and also an active member in Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace. Welcome, both of you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Let's get right into talking about your activism. I thought maybe you could each talk a little bit about the organizations that you're working with, just a little background about Citizen Action in your case.
Sure. Citizen Action is a grassroots membership organization that fights for social, racial, economic, and environmental justice. We are a people power organization and making sure that we lift up the voices of marginalized groups that typically are left unheard and fighting for legislation that's going to improve the lives of individuals. We also happen to be a member of People's Action, which is the national organization.
Okay. And Joe, could you tell us a little bit about UNAC?
Well, UNAC is a national anti-war coalition of several hundred anti-war and social justice groups throughout the United States, and it was actually formed here in Albany in 2010. Some national organizers asked if we would host a conference, and we held a conference downtown. 800 people attended, and out of that came UNAC, and we've been fighting against the wars at home and abroad, are the way we put it these days, because there's so much connection between the war on terror and what's happening with Muslims here and immigrant rights and so forth, and the militarization of the police. So our slogan is "End the wars at home and abroad."
Okay, thank you. I thought maybe we'd divide this discussion into talking about activism before Donald Trump was elected and after Donald Trump was elected. So, Jamaica, could you tell us a little bit about what Citizen Action was working on prior to the election?
Sure. What's interesting is I think for the most part you'll find that we were still working on the same things. It's that the intensity and the sense of urgency may have changed, especially for some of our newer volunteers and members that came in. But making sure that there's affordable health care coverage for everyone and ensuring that there is racial justice through every lens. So in our education system, ensuring that funding is fair and equitable, and that schools that have predominantly Black and brown children are receiving their funding at the same rate as their counterparts. So those are just two examples, which also includes the Fight for 15 and paid family leave, where we saw great success. And then we look now and those fights still exist.
They do.
They
More
really
than
do.
ever.
Yes, and with a lot more urgency because there's been such drastic measures to revert back to a system that was already inequitable and turn back the clock of time where we had made some progress and go back to a time that is less prosperous for people and more prosperous for corporations.
Joe, how about UNAC? What were you working on up until the election?
Well, one of the reasons that UNAC was formed in 2010 was with the election of Barack Obama. A lot of people thought, well, the wars have ended, you know. I mean, now we're going to go into a period of peace. And a number of organizations and individuals in the anti-war movement thought differently, thought as long as there are wars that are continuing overseas that we needed to have an anti-war coalition, and UNAC came out of that. Interestingly enough, at the conference in 2010, at the end of the conference, we marched up to the mosque on Central Avenue where there have been FBI attacks and people unjustly arrested and imprisoned, to show our solidarity, the anti-war movement, with the Muslim community, which is under attack, and hundreds of Muslims actually have been put in jail for false reasons. And that's part of the war on terror. That's the domestic side of the war on terror. So we've been supporting rights of Muslims and defending against these attacks ever since. When we saw things like the militarization of the police and the Black Lives Matter movement, we of course supported those activities, and we see them all connected. You can draw the dots very clearly, you can connect the dots very clearly these days, and so we have to come up with a full program to help people that are suffering in this society and abroad. And with the election of Trump, there's much greater urgency, and we're seeing a lot more participation in the streets and in the activities that we do.
On January 21st, that was a historic day. I think that was a day when more people came out into the streets in the U.S. than ever before. Right here in Albany, Jamaica was one of the main organizers of an event that brought out up to 9,000 people in the Inaugurate Resistance rally, and at the same time that Jamaica was working on that, Joe was in Washington as one of the organizers of the events there. So I'd like to spend just a few minutes talking about that particular event and how it was different, and what are your impressions and what did it mean to you?
Sure. I mean, the biggest difference was the amount of people that came out that found it necessary to have their voices heard. Some who had never gone to a march or a rally before, never thought it was necessary, and really felt that sense to be a part of the action and to stand up against bigotry and hatred, and a real collaboration of issues and groups and people, regardless of if it was Planned Parenthood stood with us, as well as a number of other organizations, the Capital District Coalition Against Islamophobia. So those groups who typically had a focus in a very singular issue and said, you know, this is our fight, this is what we're fighting for, came together and said, you know what, we're all standing together, united, and we're all going to stand up for the rights of everyone. That was probably the biggest difference for me, was that sense of unity that crossed all lines, crossed all barriers, and brought people together.
Gave people hope. I
Yes,
think.
absolutely. It really did give a lot of people hope.
And Joe, how about your impressions in Washington, D.C. that day?
Well, actually, I was there for 2 days. I was there during the inauguration when there were protests that took place. And that was very interesting because in the streets of D.C., I would say there were more protesters than people coming to see the inauguration on Inauguration Day. And there were many different rallies and marches that were taking place, and a number of people tried to get to the actual inaugural parade to do some protests there. There were checkpoints, and it was very difficult to get through, and people had to wait on long lines, and they were explicitly going after the people who were carrying protest signs and so forth. There was also 260 people that were arrested that day. They were corralled by the police, and there were a lot arrested. And the terrible thing about that is many people have done civil disobedience in the past in Washington, D.C., and you usually get like a traffic ticket type thing, you know, and you pay it and you go home and you've made your protest. This time, these people were not charged with a minimal violation like that. They were charged with felonies. So there were over 200 people that are now facing felony rioting charges and up to 10 years in jail and $25,000 fine, and something the movements had to come together. Mm-hmm. The next day just was incredible. You know, I just could not. I've organized marches in D.C. from the time of Vietnam War period, where I worked as a full-time staff person for the National Peace Action Coalition, which organized some of the big actions around Vietnam. And I have never seen anything like this. 4 hours later, when I was leaving, people were still streaming down the side streets to get to the mall area. And it became so big that the planned march couldn't happen. And it was so big that most people didn't even hear the speakers. I mean, there was a speakers platform set up, but it was almost impossible to get to proximity to this speakers platform. And I would say there were 1 million people in D.C. that day. But there were also 500,000 in New York City, and 500,000 in L.A., and 250,000 in Chicago, and 200,000 in Boston, and cities all across the country were doing what Albany was doing, but also all across the world. There were huge rallies all across the world. Sometimes I think that it's not just us who should vote for the American president, but people all over the world should, because they're affected by the fact that we have troops in 130 countries and 20 times the number of foreign military bases as all other countries in the world put together. And so they follow our elections, and maybe they should have a vote in these things too. And that day was a very incredible day, and that really sparked. I remember hearing, as I was leaving that rally on the news media, is this just a flash in the pan, or is this a movement? And I think we could say right now it's a movement.
That leads to my next question. Was it a success?
Absolutely. It was a success on multiple fronts, including the number of new people that were engaged. And of those new people, because some would say, oh, well, they came out once and they went home. No, I have the emails to prove that they haven't. It took weeks for me to get through all of those emails and to reply back and to make follow-up phone calls, because people were hungry and desired that, continued momentum. And also, representatives took notice. It was not on deaf ears, although there may have been some that said, oh, well, it's just a couple people. That was an alternative fact. And the reality was that numerous people came out, and they are continuing to take actions. There are continued rallies and protests and phone calls to legislators and letter writing campaigns and all of this great organizing that's happening to ensure that we don't slide back any further.
Yeah. An indication of how successful that day was what my son did. My son he has progressive politics, but he's not an activist like I am, and he always tells me I'm too radical. But he decided he had to be in Washington, D.C. that day. He lives in Pennsylvania. So he put on his Facebook feed, his wife Rachel and he were going down to D.C. And 25 of his friends said, "Can we come too?" So they organized 25 of them, all went down there, and for most of them it was their first rally. And I think that's really indicative of a new generation of people coming out. And I think the reason that people are so angry is so many of the gains that are being cut back on are things that people won through activity and protest and strikes and stuff over the generations. And now they want to go backwards and pull that back. And it's going to be very hard for them to do that, because women are not going to give up their rights, and people want health care, and people want good jobs, and they don't want all the money going to the top 1/10 of 1%. And that's the basis of a movement that's really going to continue. We can't just wait till the next election in 2 or 4 years and say that's going to do it for us. We need to oppose these draconian issues and legislations that are being proposed at every step of the way, and that's why people are coming out. They're not sitting still, and that's a wonderful thing that gives me hope.
Well, since January 21st, there have been several other really major rallies and protests. There's been rallies around women's reproductive rights, the women's strike, the rallies at the airports over the deportations. How's the politics of organizing changed? What's happening here?
You can go first.
Or we can go on to the next question. If you
I think more people are becoming very active. That's one thing. One demonstration I was at last week, was a very interesting one. ICE, the immigrant people that deport people, along with Homeland Security, have a office up by the airport there, very close to the airport, so they could just put people on planes and send them back. And a young woman was asked to report there, and she was very frightened. She's been living in the country for 14 years. Her husband one day didn't come home. He was picked up just recently, and he was deported. She has 2 young elementary school age children who are American citizens because they were born in this country. And now ICE has called her in and said, we want you to come in for an interview. And she had to tell her children, I don't know if I'm coming back. If I don't come back, if I'm not here after school, I want you to go next door to these people and be with them. And it shows the human tragedy of the kinds of things that Trump is trying to do right now. But when she came up to the ICE office, we had 80 people that went with her, and we protested there. And it had a really good effect. You know, some ICE officer came out and said, you can't be here, it's private property. People started yelling back, when has the United States of America become private property? I know that's where you want to go, but maybe, but it's not. This is our this is our country. This is not private property. And so we didn't leave, and we stayed right there. And this woman went in and had her interview, and they didn't deport her. She came out, and I think they were afraid to deport her because of the light that we were shining on that process. And they told her she has to come back next month, so next month we'll be there with her too. And today there was someone else that had to go up there. Unfortunately, it conflicted with the rally we were having downtown. So, but others were there, and people were there, and I don't know the outcome of that. But that's what we need to do. We need to stand up for each other. All the organizations that fight for social justice and change right now are forming these emergency committees so that when there's something happens to a Muslim or an immigrant or someone in our communities, that we can all come together and support them. And I think that's an outcome of what was started on January 21st.
And that very much is the big change in organizing. It's having those rapid response teams in place, networking with lots of different organizations and individuals, and working cooperatively to offer support directly to affected individuals that are in a situation, and continuing on that path and making sure that we can have pop-up events that happen on a daily or weekly basis, because keeping that constant presence is a part of that movement and making sure that all voices are heard. That I see is one of the biggest changes between before the election and now, that wake-up call causing us to rapidly respond.
Well, we have about 10 minutes left. So maybe we could talk a little bit about some of the issues that you think are most important. I saw a photo of you at a rally for public education. Could you talk about why that's so important? I don't know if everybody's aware of it.
Right. So I will first say that there is no one issue that's more important than another. And the fact that some would try to divide us by saying, well, I only have enough for one. We can only fund this one thing, so we've got to choose. All of these issues are incredibly important, and sacrificing those in the 99% on a continuing basis can't happen. When it comes to education, our public schools are underfunded. There was a court case that was won 10 years ago, went to the highest court in New York State that said, yes, you need to fund our schools equitably. There needs to be a formula to make that happen. And for 2 years they did it. And then the recession hit, and they said, you know what, not only can we not fund at this level, we have to take some money back. So the gap elimination adjustment happened. They took money back. Just this past year, they finally finished repaying the gap elimination adjustment money that was owed, but they're still not fully funding our schools. There are some public schools that get 100% of their funding, but there are far more needy schools, our highest need districts, that are receiving not enough money to address the needs and make sure that children are college and career ready when they graduate from high school. This impacts the economics of our communities. This affects, what the job market looks like. It has a direct impact on the tax base of those communities. because if they fully funded districts like Albany, Schenectady, and beyond, some places would be able to give a refund to taxpayers. So children will be fully educated, taxpayers get some money back, we're adding to the base of our economy.
And educating our kids.
And educating our children. What a win-win. And it ties into all of these other areas, including the economic gap that exists where the top 1% receive the bulk of the income, and then the rest of us are fighting, and we're not taxing fairly. So that top 1% is getting a tax break, where people like us sitting in this room are paying a higher rate and then not able to afford simple things in life that are required. So it all is interconnected on a regular basis, and that's why we had the rally for education. That's why we continue to call our senators and our assembly members and write letters to the governor and say, hey, listen, you said that education was important, prove it.
Good point. And Joe, how about UNAC? What's the focus of UNAC going to be at this point? Is it still on war, or?
Well, all these issues are really important.
Yeah.
Really, when you look at the people that Trump is choosing for his cabinets, they're people that are attacking the areas that they're part of, attacking public schools while they send their kids to these great private schools, and attacking the EPA, cutting the EPA when we have climate change so clearly visible to everybody that lives in this country and around the world. So we're starting to see that. But one very important issue, which you don't see covered enough in these things, is the question of war. And our wars are increasing, not decreasing. Trump is just wanting to give, $57 billion more to the war budget, and already 57% of our discretionary budget goes to the military. And what could that money be used for? It could be used for schools and health care and infrastructure. Our pipes are so old that everybody's water is poisonous these days, and they're not doing anything about it. That he wants to build a wall or whatever. So war is a very important thing. I believe that Trump is seriously thinking of escalating war. He's talking about what to do with North Korea. He's talking about what to do with Iran. He did send troops into Yemen just recently, where they basically shot up an entire village, anything that moved. One American was killed, several were wounded, a plane was brought down. Syria is another issue where we're possibility of bringing in more troops and so forth. We're doing regime change in all these places. We haven't ended the wars in Afghanistan or Iraq. We have sending drones into places like Pakistan and so forth. The thing is that a lot of these protests that are against Trump also have supported the Democratic Party, which has been also a war party just as much as the Republican Party, and that's been a problem. So there's been a reluctance to talk about the situation with war. We have a president now who casually talks about, well, why can't we use nuclear weapons, as we want to modernize our nuclear capabilities, talking about the possibility of now giving nuclear weapons to South Korea to defend against North Korea. These are stupid things, and if there's two things that could end the world today, it's climate change and war, especially nuclear war. And this is an important issue that we need to bring into the movements that are happening right now in the streets, and that's one of the jobs that UNAC sees itself doing.
Okay, we're down to about 3 minutes. Jamaica, are there any other specific issues that you'd like to bring up?
I think what I would say is it's not about the specific issues, it's about getting out, getting engaged with local organizations or committees, and making sure that you are being an ally, that your voice is heard, that you are standing up and speaking out. And as we keep saying, they're all interconnected. Every single one of them, the environment, our economics, jobs, education, there's an overlap. And if we can truly create an equitable system, then that is going to be beneficial for everyone instead of we can stop fighting against Trump and just talk about the policies that are going to allow everyone to be prosperous.
To wind things up, how can people who are watching today, how can they get involved? What's their first step? Say they've never been involved in any sort of activism. What do you suggest?
I suggest they go to www.citizenactionny.org, and wherever they are, we are across New York State, and there are 7 different regions. You can click on my name, it has my contact information, or do some other research. Social media is wonderful. There's a lot of different organizations to choose from. We represent just a few, and take that initiative, do the research, and also read, expand your knowledge base. Pick up a book that's by Professor Taylor, or read more about Malcolm X. Expand your base so that you can be a better advocate.
Good advice. Any last thoughts, Joe?
Well, all organizations are growing during this period. Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace is holding huge meetings. I encourage people to go there and encourage them to go to Bethlehem Neighbors, BethlehemForPeace.org, to the website, and go to the UNAC website, which is UNACPeace, UNACPEAC.org, and get involved. It's a time to get involved, and we really have to build the movement. The left in this country has been so divided while the right wing has been coming together, but we represent the interests of the vast majority in this country, and we have to come together and start expressing our strength.
Well, we're out of time. Thank you both so much. You've done a
Thank
wonderful
you.
job here of pointing out what we need to do. And thank you all for joining us today. Please join us for future shows where we'll be talking about the effect of Trump's policies on undocumented workers and the deportations, and also lots more about war. Thank you.